Well, thank you for inviting me to your beautiful university, and hello to people on Instagram. I think this is a new one for me, to be live on Instagram actually. Yeah, I'm always pleased to come to a university because obviously you're the leaders of the future, aren't you? And the influencers of the future. So again, thank you very much for inviting me. I went to university once by mistake. I didn't really know what to do with myself. When I found myself sat in a lecture theatre listening to someone lecture on business studies, I sat there thinking, what the hell was I thinking? Coming to university, wanted to learn about business studies, because I realised I had no interest at all, not the slightest. So I actually dropped out of university, and that's how I ended up joining the police, but it wasn't something that I'd always wanted to do. I wasn't one of these kids that ran around with a plastic policeman's hat on or anything. You know, it wasn't a lifelong intention to do it. In fact, I was going to go backpacking around Europe. That's a sort of really classic dropout thing to do, that, isn't it? Drop out from uni, go backpacking, fruit picking, that kind of thing. But then I saw an advertisement in my local newspaper for the police. I couldn't make my mind up. Backpacking, police. So I flipped a coin, and it came up heads, and so I applied for the police, which is, I suppose, the beginning of a long journey, which has brought me to be here speaking in front of you today. So yeah, I wasn't really desperate to be a police officer, but the thing is, it seemed interesting. You know, it seemed like every day would be different, and that's got to be good, right? Certainly more interesting than the business studies lectures, anyway. So, but when I went into the police, unfortunately, I was really crap at it. I was terrible. I was a terrible uniformed police officer. I really was. I didn't realise until I was in that uniform how naive I was and how young I was at 19. I really was. I didn't deal with confrontation very well, and I was a bit slow to learn compared with my companions I joined with. And so for the first 2 years it was horrible. In fact, I only stayed in the job just to prove to myself, I think, that I could survive the first 2 years. I was already thinking, what else am I going to do when I stop? But anyway, I survived the first 2 years, then I did a bit longer, and it got to 4 years. And then I got a little bit better at it. I was starting to become okay, and then I got an attachment to the drug squad. Now, the reason a youngster like me would get an attachment to the drug squad at that time is because there was the mother of all moral panics happening about drugs. And that was about crack cocaine, because for years, literally years, the tabloid newspapers had been running stories about how crack cocaine was destroying America, especially destroying black communities in America. There was a very racist hint to the way the tabloids were presenting it. And what this meant is that the moment we actually got any crack cocaine on the streets of the UK, the general public went nuts. I mean, they were really, really fearful about it. And of course this feeds back into politics, and it did feed back into politics. So the Home Office instructed all of the chief constables, you must make drugs your #1 priority, above anything, above domestic violence, above terrorism, anything. This is your #1 priority. And they increased the funding for the police to do that. So there's suddenly loads of pressure on all the chief constables to get results. The government's demanding it, right? Which is where I came in. They thought if we can get loads of young cops soaking up the expertise of these drug squads, then they'll go out and they'll bring loads of results for us. But of course the drug squad hated having those rookies underfoot. I didn't know what I was doing with all this surveillance and things that the drug squad did. But then one of them looked at me one day and said, do you fancy having a go at buying some crack cocaine? I thought, well, that's a really strange question. But yeah, I'm game for anything. So I was given 20 quid, and there was a quick observation point set up, and I was sent to this terrace door in the city of Derby. I knocked on the door, and this huge guy answered, and he says, yeah, what do you want? You're not a student, are you? I fucking hate students. I thought, actually, I have no idea who I am. Because I hadn't really thought of a cover story. I was sent to knock on this door, and that's what I did. So I thought, that'll do. Yeah, I'm a student. And he looked at me like I was stupid. Well, maybe I was. And then there's this woman laughing behind him. She said, is he stupid or what? You've just told him you hate students. And he says, yeah, but who would be stupid enough to admit it? So anyway, it wasn't really that difficult. He presented me my little stone of crack cocaine, and I left. And you know, as I was leaving, he said, "You take care now. Don't get yourself arrested," which I thought was quite considerate. So I left, and the point is, you know, when I went back to the drug squad, my little stone of crack, the point is, it wasn't that difficult. Not really. I just knocked on the door and asked him, and I bought it from him. It's, you know, straightforward. But that's because that was the first point in this country that that kind of low-end undercover work had happened. It was an entirely new tactic. I mean, of course, we'd had undercover work before, but high-end undercover work, not sort of working at the street level and trying to work up. So drug dealers like him, they didn't know that the police had this new tactic. They didn't expect me to be a problem, really. But of course, he went to prison, and he told everyone else in prison that the police had a new game. And of course, it became instantly more difficult. But that day really defined the next 14 years of my life, work, well, beyond that, it's defined my life since, because the drug squad, their eyes lit up, and they thought, wow, we could get loads of quick results here. We could arrest loads of people doing this. And they talked to all the other drug squads, and in no time at all, I was travelling all over the country, working for other people. And a few days operations within a few weeks, and in no time at all, I was doing no less than 6 or 7 months at a time. Because of course it got more difficult, so I had to spend more time getting to know the community, developing a reputation. And so that's what I did. And of course there was no training, I hadn't been taught. I was literally making this up as I went along, and in fact I helped develop training about 4 years later for undercover officers around the rest of the country. But I wasn't trained, so I was wondering, really, as I was discovering as I was going along, what was the best way to do it, and what was the best way to dress up. So to start with, I dressed like a travelling scally. Now you're all Southerners, aren't you? So you're not going to know that word. Scally. It's like a northern word for a travelling thief. So I would be there in my full trackie and my Nike Air Max trainers. And no disrespect if anyone's into sportswear, but it does happen to be the uniform of thieves. So I wore that for a while, and that opened up a few doors. You know, I could talk about burgling houses and nicking cars, those kind of things. But I quickly realised that actually the people that had the most connections, the people who could introduce me further up the chain, is the people who were really struggling with life, people who were living in squats or homeless, or they were sort of part of that street community. They're really the people who were pushed to the fringes of society. So I started dressing more like them and hanging around with them. And they did have the connections, and the reason they had the connections is because those people who were really struggling, they bought more drugs than anyone else. They were using drugs more problematically, so they were actually sought after by the higher up gangsters who would want to manage their supply because they were real cash cows for them. So they could introduce me further up the chain, and I could meet the regional dealers and gather evidence of conspiracy against whole gangs. And so that's what I did. And I suppose the first time I thought I was going to die would be in Leicester in 2001. So by this, no, that would be the second time. No, so the first time I thought I was going to die, I was in Stoke-on-Trent, in a part of Stoke called Fenton, where I'd been buying weights of heroin from this guy, and so I thought he trusted me. You know, and by weights I mean more than just £10 bags, increased amounts that I was sort of telling him I was selling on to other people. So I called on him this one day, and he opened the door, and it's like a 2-up-2-down terrace house with steps up, a bit like you see in Coronation Street or something. So there's steps up. So I was looking up to him, and he opened the door and he put a samurai sword to my throat straight away. He says, "You're a fucking drug squad. You're DS. I know you are." And his face was blood red, and saliva flying out of his mouth. He was that angry. And so I could see this fury in his face and feel the steel on my throat. I thought, well, this is it. And then there was this woman behind him, and she started laughing. And she said, wow, I thought he was going to say he was then. And then the two of them just started laughing, and he took the sword away. He was just winding me up. Or maybe he just had a new sword, he wanted to try it out or something. I'm not sure. Or more the case, he was just probably just reminding me he was boss. And they like to do this when they're building reputations. But I managed to buy some heroin off him. I was a bit shaky. I was putting it into a cigarette packet. I used to smoke in those days. Put it into a cigarette packet and walking away from the address. And then as I was about to put the cigarette in the pocket, I had to stop. There's a blade in front of me. Someone's pointing a blade to my stomach. And he says, give me that. And someone's trying to rob me of the heroin I've just bought. So I thought, oh God, mate, not after what I've just gone through for that, no way are you having this heroin. So I started sort of trotting backwards, because just running backwards to see if I could run away from him. And you know what he said? He said, hang on mate, no, just come here a minute. No. So I ran away, and I managed to run faster than him. And he just seemed very frustrated that I'd run away. And I managed to get away, but yeah, I suppose that was the first day where I realised that things had really changed, because I think that was about 4 years after the first time I'd done it, and I was beginning to realise that the streets were becoming really, really dangerous. And this is an important shift in just 4 years. And the only reason it got more dangerous is because of my presence in the streets. That's what's changed, generally. But a few years later, I did an operation in Leicester, and I met one of the main targets for the operation right at the start of this operation. I hadn't seen him for months, so whenever I was trying to phone him to get him to come out, he had excuses, or he would send somebody else. He would deal by proxy, because I think it was just part luck that he decided to deal to me earlier on. But the trouble is, when I bought from him earlier on in the operation, I wasn't wearing any technical equipment, because you don't at the start, because you might get searched. So we needed some corroborating evidence of him. So I needed to get one more buy from him. But he wasn't coming out. Now I knew he was really into his clothes. He was always into designer clothing. So I thought, well, he won't come out and sell me some heroin. Maybe I can get him to come look at some clothes. So I got hold of some counterfeit clothing, some counterfeit Stone Island jackets. Phoned him up, and that tempted him out. The trouble is, he brought two of his mates with him. And we met at this really secluded car park. It was actually quite near the centre of Leicester, but it was secluded, and there was hardly any cars there, and we met right at the far end of this car park. And when he turned up, he's looking at the jackets, and his two huge mates, the kind of people who just spend all day lifting weights every day, because they work security at night and they do drug dealing at day. And they were huge. And so he looked at the jacket, he says, well, you're just trying to sell me these, or do you want something? You want something from me? And I says, well, if you carry him wide, I'll have like 20 stone from you. Because I'm thinking, if I get crack cocaine off him, because I've already had heroin off him, that'll mean an extra prison sentence. So he gets out the biggest block of crack I've ever seen. It's huge. It's like bigger than a VHS tape. You won't know what a VHS tape looks like, will you? Yeah. Anyway, it was a big block of crack, and he starts cutting a little sliver off for me while he's sat in his passenger seat. In the meantime, his mates are looking at the jacket, and then one of them suddenly pushes me up against this fence and start feeling that jacket. And the trouble is, the technical equipment I'm wearing ain't James Bond tech. This is not high-end secret spy stuff. And as soon as he gets to the button with the camera in it, he looks at it, and there's no doubt what's winking up at him. And there's this little lens in the little hole in the button. And the jacket I was wearing was like an old-fashioned denim jacket with mecha buttons. And he says he fucking is as well, man. He's 5'0". He's 5'0". Now, at this moment, one of the advantages I had working undercover, one of the things that I was quite good at, or was useful to me, is that at any point when I had adrenaline, big surge of adrenaline, I got the sensation that time slows down completely, which makes me feel, or made me, it doesn't anymore, made me feel like I had all the time in the world to think. So it was a really empowering feeling, actually, quite a heady feeling. And when I had that surge of adrenaline, I thought, I have got to get him, I've got to stop him telling him what he's found. I've got to stop him communicating that information. Because if he tells him what he's found, I'm dead. So I started shouting and swearing at him. I says, what are you fucking doing, picking at my jacket? It's not even my jacket. I borrowed it off Jackie this morning, so what the fuck are you talking about? What are you doing? And he's like, wow, I wasn't expecting that. And it interrupted his train of thought. And he even started, you could even see he was doubting himself a little bit. Like, wow, he can't be, he was behaving like this. But then I didn't let up at all. I didn't let him any space to talk or communicate with his friend. I just kept swearing at him. And I went to his mate and grabbed the jacket, and I slowly, as slow as I could, started folding this jacket up, putting it back in its bag. And then I started walking really slowly away, still screaming abuse at him, like insulting him, saying, this is my jacket, what the fuck are you on about? And he's like, what? And I'm still shouting as I'm sort of walking as slow as I can, because I know if I run, they're going to follow me and they're going to get me. But if I'm really, really slow, I can sort of feed that element of doubt. And I get halfway across the car park and I hear this running feet behind me, and I'm thinking, oh, I got halfway. Maybe if I spin round quick, get one punch in, then maybe I can outrun the rest to the end of the car park. And I spin round, and it's my mate, isn't it? It's the one who knows me. And he says, oh no, don't you want your ting? I'm thinking, you want to sell me crack? No. Okay. And he says, don't mind my mate, he's just a dickhead. I says, yeah, he is a dickhead. And he's pulling at my clothes and I don't know what he's on about. And all this while I'm shouting this. And his mate at this point is literally screaming across the car park at him, saying, I'm fucking telling you, it's he, man. And he's like, so I pay him the 20 quid and get the cracks all in this, perfectly framed in the camera. And I carry on walking. And then when he goes back, and then I suddenly hear the car screech. It's like it's suddenly taking off after me. I'm thinking, right, now I'll run. And I just ran, and the car zoomed across the car park towards me and got near to me at the exit. Now the exit went onto like an inner ring road, so it was dual carriageway. And it's quite near the centre of Leicester, so it's actually part of the inner ring road. So I turned left onto the pavement, and the car comes up the pavement after me, speeding down the pavement after me, and I'm just sprinting till my last breath. I'm sprinting, and I managed to get to where there's a roundabout, and there's a metal railing that separates the pavement from the road, and I just managed to get to that metal railing. Of course, the car can't fit, so it has to screech the brakes on the pavement. So he must have, and I looked behind, it must have missed me by about probably 2 meters, something like that. So I carried on walking, and from that point I could very easily get to the pedestrian area and they couldn't follow me. So I carried on walking, and they went round the roundabout a couple of times. So then I went back to the safe location, exhibited my drugs, and told them the car registration number, the description of the people in the car and everything. The intelligence guy, because you have an intel guy dedicated to each operation, he went out, obviously did his homework, came back. He was laughing when he came back in. He says, I don't know why they didn't just shoot you. There's loads of intel about a gun in that car. And we all laughed, which was a peculiar thing to do, but I suppose that's just a relief of that tension. And that was, I think, 8 years, maybe 7 years after I'd started doing that kind of work. And the change in street level organised crime in that time was extraordinary. The amount of guns and the violence that was going. And I suppose that's one of the things that caused me some elements of doubt about what I was doing. But the trouble is, I was so wrapped up in the world of covert drugs policing, that I just ignored all my doubts and carried on. Now, one of the ways that I would try and infiltrate a gang is by, wherever I would go to an inner city area, I would look for the most vulnerable person. I would look for the most vulnerable of the street people. And the reason for that is the most vulnerable people are the easiest to manipulate. They are. But also, the most vulnerable people tend to be the most problematic drug consumers, and so they have the most connections. They're the people who can introduce me up the chain. And one guy I met in Nottingham was a guy called Cammy, and I liked him. He was good fun, you know. He had a really sort of dry wit, good observational humour. You know, he was interesting. So I spent a lot of time with him. I wooed him really because he was very useful to me because he was on bail for dealing heroin for a gang called the Bestwood Cartel, and that was a gang which I was under a lot of pressure to try and find out a lot about, run by a gangster called Colin Gunn, quite an infamous character. So I got to know Cammy. I spent a lot of time with him. I listened to his stories of his childhood, problematic childhood, and I went shoplifting with him, which was fantastic fun. It really is good fun. If you know you've got to get out of jail free card, it's great fun. So I suppose, like Cammy and a lot of other people, I spent a lot of time listening to people because with me having to learn how to behave, to fit in, the best way for me to do that is to use empathy. Is to try and understand people, really understand what motivated them and what took them to the streets to be using heroin or crack problematically. So nowadays I refer to it as weaponising empathy, which is essentially what I did, isn't it? It's quite a cynical use of a positive human trait. So I got really friendly with Cammy, and that job was hugely successful. I think it was 56 people arrested or something like that. But unfortunately, at the end of that 6 or 7 month operation, I think it was a 7-month operation, Cammy was also arrested. And because he'd been committing offences on bail while I was with him. And while he was in the police cells, he ended up being on minute-to-minute watch, suicide watch. And the reason for that, as he told the interviewing officers, was that he thought I was his one friend in the world. The one person that he could speak to, that he'd finally found somebody that he could talk to about his bad childhood and his problems. And he'd not had that before. So for him, that was the final straw in his traumatic existence, and my betrayal of it. Which, as you can imagine, hit me like a ton of bricks, really. Emotionally, I found that really, really difficult. And again, it was a big clue, really, that what I was doing wasn't necessarily the right thing. But these doubts, I resisted. Although, when I heard that about Cammy, I actually stopped undercover work for a while. I thought, I can't do this anymore. It's just too emotionally taxing. It's too difficult. But then a few weeks after that, the detective sergeant who arranged these operations phoned me up and said, look, Woodsy, we need you to do this job because these gangsters are even more dangerous than the last one. We've had 2 undercovers try and get close to them already, and they can't get close. And unfortunately, by this time, I was a sort of victim of my own success because I'd become like a troubleshooter. Because I'd survived things like the event in Leicester, I was seen as someone who could cope with that kind of stress. It meant I got the most stressful jobs. I got the most difficult jobs, which is probably why I struggle with PTSD nowadays. I'm diagnosed with chronic PTSD. So all of these times, all of these more difficult jobs I was doing was piling on the psychological damage that I now suffer from. But anyway, he said, Woodsy, we need you to do this job because this gang is even worse than the last. And he explained to me that they were using sexual violence as part of their reputation building. They were gang raping people. And this is a very infamous gang called the Burger Bar Boys. a gang from Birmingham, and they'd taken over the heroin and crack cocaine market over in Northampton. And so I agreed to do the job, and I went to Northampton, and I spent weeks and weeks building up a reputation, because I knew they were very sensitive to new faces. They'd obviously burned two undercover, I mean by burnt, they spotted, they got rid of 2 undercover operatives in the area. So I spent weeks getting to know the people who handled stolen goods, so I knew exactly who would handle bottles of spirits, who would buy baby clothes off me. And if you ever do get into shoplifting, baby clothes, there's always a market for them, isn't there? Children's clothes, because they'd grow up so fast. So there's always someone going to be buying things like that. So I got to know them, and I got this reputation. So when I got introduced to the Burger Bar Boys, and I'll never forget this day, I persuaded this vulnerable person to introduce me, and he took me there. And the Burger Bar Boys were holding court in this snooker club in the centre of Northampton. So I went in, I was directed into the gents' toilets. This was quite a large room, and my mate was there as well. And one of them came in with a hood up, came in, opened the cubicle, stood on the toilet, and then shut the door and looked over the top down at me and said, "What's this?" And the moment he said that, 4 hooded figures came in and they started walking around me. And then one of them would headbutt me on the ear, or then another one would push me, and another one would punch me in the ribs. So all this time I'm being interrogated by the guy looking down at me, and he's also interrogating my mate, and then checking our stories together. And I knew the reputation of these people, and I recognised the guy looking at me as somebody who was implicated in 7 different murders in Birmingham. And he was also the person who sourced the submachine guns for the double murder of Letitia Shakespeare and Charmaine Harris just a year before. So I knew the capacity and reputation of these people, and I was starting to hurt as well. So I really just became convinced I wasn't going to be walking out of there in one piece or at all. And then suddenly he said, "All right then, what do you want?" And I said, "I'll have 1 and 1, please," meaning I'll have a 0.4 of heroin and a 0.4 of crack. And I gave him 40 quid, and he paid me, and then he gave them to me. And then we exchanged phone numbers, so that was the most crucial part of the operation, really, the fact that he'd accepted me enough to actually put me in his phone number. Probably because he saw me as a bit of a wheeler dealer who might have larger amounts of money and would want to deal with me himself. So then I was in, and I spent the next few months gathering evidence of conspiracy against the 6 main gangsters who were running the supply. But also, after 7 months, I'd gathered evidence against 90 other people. So 96 people were involved in that by the end of the 7 months. But it was a bit of a rocky road, because every single day that I was in their company, every single day, I felt that I was potentially about to receive some violence. It never went away. They never let up on the intimidation. Oh no, apart from one day, when I went to meet them, because they were normally really professional, always sober, always on it, always very sharp. But one day I went to meet them, and I got in the back of the car, and there was this huge fog of cannabis smoke came out of the car. They were clearly, all of them, well, there was 3 in the car, 2 in the front, 1 in the back. They were completely stoned, clearly. Like eyes almost completely closed. And the guy in the back, and this is again the same guy that had been in the toilet cubicle, looked at me and said, "No." To rewind a little bit, for this operation, I decided to use a name which was almost identical to my own nickname. I was calling myself Woody. And the reason for that is because I got so aware of how close I'd come to being killed so many times, and I'd come so aware of the extent of corruption, that this was my way of sort of sticking my fingers up at the universe and sort of daring them to get me, if that makes sense. Perhaps another indication of my state of mind at the time as well. So anyway, I was going by the name of Woody, and I got in the back of this car, and this very stoned gangster looked at me and said, "Woody man, why do they call you Woody man? Is it because you looks like Woody Allen man?" I'm thinking, are you kidding? Woody Allen? The short comic from New York. And I didn't say that. And this just came into my head almost as an instant anecdote. I says, no, actually, no. The reason I got called Woody as a nickname is because, you know the film Toy Story, yeah? And he went, oh yeah, clearly a Toy Story fan. I says, you know when the film Toy Story came out, I says, you know the bit where the naughty kid picks up Woody and burns a hole in his forehead with a magnifying glass? I says, you remember that? He says, oh yeah. I says, well, at the time that film came out, I had skin cancer on my forehead. And I had to have laser surgery to get rid of it. You can probably still see the scar still. And he was going, oh yeah. And I says, because I had that laser surgery, my mates were taking the piss out of me and started calling me Woody, and it sort of stuck. And this 7 times murdering gangster looked at me and went, oh man, that's so mean. Okay. So anyway, I bought the drugs and I walked away. But you know, I like to. I don't always tell that story, but I like to tell that story because it's a reminder that you know I tell these stories about these scary gangsters doing gangster shit and killing people and using sexual violence, but I bet when he was 12 years old, he wasn't thinking, I'm going to grow up to be a big scary gangster. I bet he wasn't. And in fact, someone like him, or someone who was in the earlier stages of development, I was buying heroin from in Leicester a few years before. And when I met him, he was 16, and he was a nice kid. You could have a laugh with him. I could get on with him. He was funny. But he was part of a bigger gang. Now, back in, I think it was 2001, back then, to buy heroin off a child was really unusual. Now, of course, you're more likely to buy them off a child than not, because that's the way the market's gone in response to policing. But back then it was quite unusual. And over 6 months, I saw that kid go from a pleasant, likeable 16-year-old to a terrifying 17-year-old. Because he was having to learn to be aggressive and intimidating from his companions, from his peers, because that's how he survived in that environment. Because if you can't be intimidating, then if you can't be prepared to use violence, then you're going to lose territory, which means you lose money. If you're not scary, then the moment someone needs to pass some information to the police, then they're going to pass it about you because you're not scary. You're going to get grassed up. So in order to survive, he had to learn. I saw him go from a nice child to a horrible, terrifying man. And so that's why I like to make reference to that story, that even that 7 times murderer, I could see the child in him. I could see the child, that he would see that and say, oh, that's so mean. And the point of that is that we have made these people. We have made them. This only happens because the drug markets are illegal. No one is behaving like that to sell you a pint of beer. So at the end of that operation, 96 people there was evidence against, 96. And I was excited, to be honest. I was pleased. 7 months of a really seriously unpleasant job, and I thought, wow, we're going to completely wipe the streets clean in Northampton in one big job. And so there were hundreds of cops brought in from counties all around 5 different counties. And when the dust had settled, I spoke to the intel guy. Every operation has its dedicated intel officer. And he said to me, yeah, because he was keeping his ear to the ground to work out the impact of that operation. He says, yeah, we've managed to interrupt the heroin and crack cocaine supply in Northampton for a full 2 hours. 7 months of work, constantly feeling like I was going to die. All that resources, hundreds of cops, to interrupt the market for 2 hours. Now, I can't say for certain that the Burger Bar Boys' infamous rivals, the Johnson crew, were the people who took up that opportunity that was created for them. But you can sort of picture the scene, can't you? They're sat round, maybe they're having a smoke, one of them receives a phone call and starts laughing. He turns to his mates and says, wow, you have no idea what the cops have done for us. This is fantastic. We're going to make a fortune. Put the call in, get more drugs quickly. Let's get a phone line there quick. And that's the reality. That when you create that opportunity, you might upset some people and send them to prison, but you make some other people incredibly happy. Incredibly. And, sometimes I speak to an audience, and it'll be a small C conservative audience, I don't know, Women's Institute or a Rotary Club or something, and someone will be quick to say, yeah, but those people deserve to go to prison. But again, I have to point out, they're a creation of the system. They're a creation of our current drug laws. They could have grown up a different way. They could have had different opportunities. But that was a big crashing blow for me, because over the time that I've worked, I knew I was causing emotional harm to people like Cami. I knew I was causing harm to vulnerable people. I knew that a lot of people who met me, their lives were made significantly worse as a result of doing so. But I justified that to myself, because I'm thinking, well, it's worth it, because I'll make society safer by putting the gangsters in prison. But I had to face up to the fact that I hadn't made society safer at all. Because wherever I created a gap in the market, someone came along and they learned to be more violent. They learned to be more intimidating, so that they didn't make the same mistakes and get caught like the last lot. And it's created an arms race, where the harder the police try and police it, the more violent it gets. Constantly. It's constantly getting more violent with every single passing year. And so I've had to face up to the fact that none of my behaviour was justified. I've caused harm at every level. I've caused harm to individual people who are just trying to cope with childhood trauma, because there's good academic evidence that 2/3 of problematic heroin users are self-medicating for childhood trauma, either physical or sexual abuse or neglect. Very good academic evidence. The children of alcoholics are particularly well represented amongst problematic heroin users. Similar for crack cocaine, this is people who are trying to deal with trauma, with mental health problems. So not only have I caused harm to those people who actually just needed help, they actually just needed safe supply and rescuing from the exploitation of organised crime, I've actually made society more dangerous by being part of this never-ending arms race. But there are other reasons why this war on drugs is counterproductive and destructive. And to explain this bit, I'll have to go back to the story with Cami and the operation in Nottinghamshire. Cami did, when I was in that operation, manage to introduce me to to a fairly serious gangster who was a sort of lieutenant of Colin Gump. And I will never forget that introduction as well. I went to meet this guy, and he pulled up in his car, and he was a sort of skinhead character in a full tracksuit. But he'd got his 12-year-old son with him, sat next to him in the car, and his 12-year-old son was wearing an identical tracksuit, identical trainers, and they had identical shaved head. It was like a mini-me. It's really strange. And he'd obviously taken his son with him just to show him how to do gangster stuff. Because as soon as he started asking me questions, he pulled me closer and put a knife into my groin, which is not very comfortable. I can assure you, it's not very nice. Quite distracting even. So he interrogated me for a while and then eventually agreed to sell to me. And the next day, we'd all had long days, and two of my backup team went off sick. So I was introduced to 2 new police officers. The first one shook his hand. I had no problem with him. And the second one, I shook his hand, and the hairs just went up on the back of my neck. There was something fundamentally about this guy that was wrong. I didn't trust him at all. Now, when you've been working undercover for weeks on end, your senses tend to be quite fine, well tuned. You know, your awareness of body language and suspicion, to the point of paranoia. So I went to the guy in charge of the operation. I said, "Look, boss, I cannot have this guy knowing what I'm doing. I don't trust him. I won't feel safe." And he was great. He said, "Well, we'll exclude them both, They haven't been in a briefing, they don't know anything about this job yet, so it's fine. We'll just exclude them, we'll run without them. So I didn't think much more of it then, because I'd been reassured. But a year later, when the empire of Colin Gunn, the Bestwood cartel, was brought down, not by me, by a follow-up operation by Nottinghamshire Constabulary, it turned out that this police officer that I'd taken exception to, a guy called Charlie Fletcher, was an employee of Colin Gunn. So he actually managed to get closer to my inner circle than I had to his. And he wasn't just a corrupt police officer, he'd been paid to join the police as a young man. And he was paid £2,000 a month on top of his police wages, plus bonuses for good information. He'd been in the police for 7 years by the time I met him. Now, in a debrief about that with senior cops, lots of senior cops have said to me since, but this one senior cop said to me, well, Woodsy, we know this happens. Of course this happens. With this much money involved, how can it not happen? With this much money involved, how can it not happen? So there's an acceptance by senior cops in this country and around the world that this corruption exists. An acceptance of it. Now, I think that if the broader public knew that and understood that, then we would get a policy change quicker. So if you take nothing else away from today, please at least talk about that. But I have to explain the mechanism of corruption and how our drug laws cause it, because it's not just the fact that there's so much money involved. It's not just the fact that there's more money involved, there's more money in the illicit drug market than any other form of criminality, by a long way, which there is. It's not just that fact. It's the fact that trying to police drugs actually causes the corruption. Causes it. It's the mechanism that causes it. Now, I'll try and explain this. So, say the police catch a kingpin character or a drug dealing gang which controls the heroin and crack in 1/4 of a city. Yeah? 1/4. The gang or kingpin character which is most able to take advantage of that gap in the market that the police have created is someone who controls another 1/4 of the city. So it gives someone the chance to expand their share of the market, which they do. And this is a mechanism that happens at every level, all over the world. All over the world. And if you increase your share of the market, you have more disposable income. And if you have more disposable income, you will always invest it in corruption. Always. Because organised crime are safer if they have corrupt assets. They can run their business more cost effectively if they have corrupt assets. They're less likely to be arrested. They're definitely less likely to get caught. So they will always do that. So the mechanism of policing is causing the corruption. Look at Mexico. There used to be 20 cartels in Mexico. Now there's only 3. And those 3 cartels have the capacity, they have a greater GDP than most West African countries. They do. And they use that money to actually corrupt those countries. So now most of West Africa are narco-states. As in they're completely taken over by transnational organised crime. Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal. They're taken over. They're no longer legitimate governments. And the reason they've done that is because West Africa is so important for the transatlantic cocaine route from Latin America. It's a distribution point in West Africa. There's been 5 military coups in West Africa in the last 12 months. 5. Now, you could say military coups in Africa are not necessarily unusual. And you'd be sort of right, because poverty, inequality, destabilised economies, the post-colonial hangover, whatever it is, has meant that there's been coups in Africa. But the 5 in West Africa in the last 12 months have been about control of the country's biggest asset in each of those nations. And the biggest asset is the bribery money from transnational organised crime for the cocaine routes. Military fighting over who will have that wealth. Now, the reason I'm emphasising that is because at the moment I'm working on something very specific, especially with Clemmy from Health Poverty Action, And what we're working on is trying to make the environmental activist movement pay attention to this. Because basically the war on drugs is destroying the planet. The war on drugs. You know, we hear about oil, we hear about coal, but we're not talking about the war on drugs causing the planet to die yet. And we need to be urgently. Because at COP26, the conference about what all the world's governments should do about the climate crisis, I mean, it was disappointing anyway, wasn't it? Were you disappointed? I was disappointed. But one thing they tried to do is to have a pledge on deforestation to stop the cutting down of the rainforests. Now, there was lots of press about Australia being the bad boy, causing a catastrophe by still using coal. But what a distraction that is. Because yeah, coal's important, but not as important as the trees. Once the rainforests are gone, they're gone. They're gone. We've just had an election in Australia. We can put pressure on Australia to stop using coal. But how do we put pressure on those governments to stop cutting trees down? You had loads of governments signing up to stop that deforestation. But guess what? It's a waste of time. Because those governments don't control their forests. How can the government make a pledge when they don't control their own backyard? Transnational organised crime control those forests. We should have had international drug dealers around that table, not the government. The wrong people were around the table. Guinea, in West Africa, is apparently having the fastest deforestation of the equatorial countries. The government doesn't control that. It's transnational organised crime cutting down those forests by they're reinvesting their wealth that they've made from the drug trade, and they're making a bit extra money by cutting the trees down because they don't care. Without good governance, we can't stop the climate crisis. We can't stop catastrophe without good governance. And the war on drugs has destroyed that governance. It's eaten it away. It's destroyed it. Because it's much more efficient for gangsters to actually control the government higher up than it is a handful of customs officials or police. Why not just control the whole government? If you can afford it, you do it. And they have. Without good governance, you can't negotiate a peace treaty. You can't instruct your police or law enforcement officials to go and stop people cutting trees down. You can't, because you're not in control. So again, if you take nothing else from this today, anyone listening, please, we need to start talking about this urgently. Urgently. And please look out for, as we develop this campaign, it'll be between LEAP and Health Poverty Action. We're just working on a film which we'll release in a few weeks. And to top it all, the UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which is the sort of belly of the beast, it's the people who control drug prohibition and keep it fired up and make sure that all the world governments carry on fighting this war. They, on the 25th of June, will release a report claiming that drug prohibition is good for the environment. So we are entering a dystopian version of a dystopian argument, really. We have to try and undermine what they're saying, and we have to get these politicians to sit up and take notice. You know, you can have climate crisis. I salute my comrades fighting the climate crisis and Extinction Rebellion or Stop the Oil. I would argue the war on drugs is an even more urgent thing to address. But there's other reasons why we need to stop this war on drugs, and one of that is because of the origins of it, the reasons for it, and what it's used for, and that is to basically persecute minorities. It is presented, our drug laws are presented by politicians as a way of coping with the harms of drugs, as a way of reacting to the harms and risks of addiction. But it's not at all, and they were never designed that way. They were never created because of the risk of the drugs. They were created to oppress minorities. This worldwide war on drugs that we have is essentially American domestic racism exported around the world with aggressive foreign policy. That's what the worldwide war on drugs is. Opium, heroin, the opioids. Opium was banned because Chinese railway workers who'd been brought in for cheap labour, they'd finished building the railways and they were looking for other jobs. And white people didn't like that. So they criminalised what they saw as their behaviour so they could target them as a minority. So they banned opium. Up until that point, the most common white people would be maybe a middle-aged mother might use opium as a medicine. That was the most common use for it. Cannabis was banned because during the Great Depression, Spanish-speaking people, Mexicans, were seen as stealing white jobs. So if you can criminalise someone's behaviour, you can persecute them as a minority, and that's what they did. Cocaine was banned as a way of oppressing southern black people. Because with the Jim Crow laws, the end of slavery, the southern states really still wanted to persecute non-white people. So they used banning cocaine just as a way of imprisoning more black people. And you can put more black people in prison, you can treat them as slave labour in prison. That's what happened. That's the reason it was done. It was all about racism. Even alcohol prohibition, even that was about persecuting minorities. The white Protestant base, political power base in America, is a very puritanical tradition. And at the beginning of the 1900s, there was a huge surge in Catholic immigrants, particularly from Italy and Ireland. And they were seen as a threat to the Protestant power base. So they were persecuted. And they were persecuted because what they was by something that was seen as more of their habit than the Protestants, and that was drinking alcohol. That's why they banned alcohol, to persecute Catholics. And there are some posters you can see, because the biggest sponsor of alcohol prohibition was the Ku Klux Klan. They hated Catholics even more than they hated black people. And there are posters about showing the burning of papists, Catholics, and the removal of their alcohol. It's always been about prejudice. And that means that it's in the DNA. That's what it's used for right around the world. It's what it's used for here. If you're black, you are 10 times more likely to be stop searched for drugs than a white person. 10 times. And then if you're caught with drugs, you're more likely to be charged than cautioned. And then when you're charged, you're more likely to be sent to prison than a white person. Now those multipliers, I was never very good at maths, but those multipliers really prove the racist DNA of our drug policy. And if you don't care about the vulnerable people who use heroin, or even care about the environment, I would argue that that racial disparity is reason enough to revise our drug laws. So, how can you help? I mean, what's the answer? The position of my organisation, which is the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. Now, we're a worldwide organisation. I'm on the board for the organisation in the United States, but also for LEAP Europe and here in LEAP UK. And we advocate full reforms, because we see this through a policing lens. The only way you're going to tackle this problem is by taking the power away from organised crime. And the only way you can take the power away from organised crime is to legally regulate the market, make the markets legitimate. Now you do that according to the relative risks of each commodity. You've got David Nutt coming here tomorrow. I'm sure he can talk about the relative risks better than I. But you do it by the relative risk. So cannabis, it's fairly low risk. It's used by huge numbers of people. So you need licensed outlets so you can protect children more effectively with ID to show you're not selling to people underage. You can have a public health element to the way that it's regulated so that people can see quite clearly the extremely high strength THC. You could maybe even consider having higher prices for the high THC content from a public health perspective. However, but at least if it's regulated, you've got some control. Whereas at the moment, we have no control. It's controlled by the worst element of our society. For heroin, we go back to the British system. The British system, up until the end of the 1960s, meant that if you had a problem with heroin, you went to the doctor and you got help. You were treated as it was a medical condition. It seems radical to so many people now, but that's the way we used to do it in this country. When the British system ended at the end of the 1960s, we only had 1,046 heroin consumers in the UK, and the number was falling. 20 years later, 20 years after giving that market, the whole market to organised crime, we had 300,000. Very clear cause and effect. The market was given to organised crime. Suddenly, it was incentivised to find as many users as possible and to exploit those people who might use it problematically to make huge amounts of money. We can go back to the British system. If we provided a safe supply to those people who use that problematically, we take the power from organised crime like that. Snatch the money out of the pockets of gangsters. We take care of vulnerable people who at the moment are marginalised and have to live on the streets. And then there's the drugs in between. All of those synthetic drugs that people really enjoy consuming. MDMA is the perfect example of a drug that is not banned because it's dangerous. It's dangerous because it's banned. Every single drug death, every single death of MDMA is because it's an unregulated product. Either it's not MDMA, it's something more dangerous, or it's four times the dose. It's a tablet that's got 4 times as much in. And so people, young people, maybe not with a huge body weight, take it and they have an accidental death. It's because it's unregulated. All of these issues, regulation solves. It could be sold in a blister pack, produced in a clean laboratory, with the perfect dosage per weight. Say, your average adult, I think, is 86, not 0.86 milligrams, something like that. Instead of the sort of 400 you find in some large tablets. All of these issues are regulatory. And by taking control, you take the power away from organised crime. If you consider that just across the channel in the Netherlands, there's a huge debate going on, and Leap Europe has an event there on the 20th of June that I'll be speaking at alongside some of my Dutch colleagues. And the political debate is raging there because they just had a journalist killed, murdered by organised crime for trying to expose their activities. So they murdered them. And organised crime are making it clear, don't you dare, anyone, talk about us. Journalists daren't talk about them. They daren't investigate. That's how powerful they've got. And this is our future we're looking at. The devastation and the corruption that's happening in the Netherlands is huge. They're a little bit ahead of us. So we need to be aware that these kind of things are going to happen here. But even the Dutch don't have county lines. Even the Dutch don't have children at the front line selling heroin and crack cocaine. And the reason for that is because our cops are so good at catching the adults. The market has adapted. And yet we still try and think we can solve it by getting tougher and tougher and tougher. Or certainly Priti Patel does. This is a health problem. The longer we treat it as a criminal one, the worse the situation is going to get. So please support Leap UK, Leap Europe, Leap in the United States. Please follow us on social media. If there's anyone out there who has any suggestions or who thinks they can help us, then please get in touch. If anyone wants to organise any speaking events, do that. And please always consider writing to your MP, get to know your MP, pester them. Every drug policy issue, write to them, tell them how things are and how you know better than they do. So with that in mind, I'll stop and see if anyone has any questions. Thanks. Yes.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was amazing. I was wondering what the reaction of like fellow police officers were when you kind of that switch happened in your mind and you eventually like left.
Yeah, well, the reaction of police has been different over time. I mean, when I resigned, I was in a bit of a mental health crisis. And part of that was because I felt like I was working for the enemy. I'd become frustrated trying to influence my colleagues with the same kind of thinking. And some were receptive, but most really weren't. And the systems, I realised there was no way the systems were going to change within policing. So I left. And obviously I was ill anyway at the time. But when I first started speaking out in 2014, I think, I just got hate mail from cops. I got real abuse. I was seen as somebody who was betraying secrets, which was seen as horrendous. You know, I was talking about supposedly the secrets of undercover policing, and the naivety in that is incredible, really, because the idea that organised crime don't know that undercover cops are out there and the tactics they use is ludicrous. But you know, I was criticised for letting the secrets out of the bag, so I was very hostile. But then Leap UK's been really influential. We have, you know, we've spent a lot of time, we've got members who are former chief constables. Two of our members were the brilliant duo Ron Hogg and Mike Barton up in Durham. You know, and between us as an organisation, we've had real influence. And so now I only get supportive emails. I only get support from colleagues, and I get lots of it. We all do at Leap. And we've had such a shift in UK policing, actually, that many police leaders in the UK are now actually leading drug policy reform debate, and they're way ahead of the politics, way ahead. So you've got police like in the Thames Valley, or Birmingham, or Durham, with diversion schemes. And the ones in Thames Valley are so far-reaching, really, that it's pre-arrest. So people are getting diverted, rather than being arrested and criminalised for possession of drugs. They're just getting sent to treatment services to see if they need help. They're not even being arrested. They're not getting a criminal record. And that's de facto decriminalisation. That's way ahead of politics. It's way ahead of the current political debate even, really. So those kind of things are happening and being led by police. And then you've got, in Cleveland, they use policing money from the Police and Crime Commissioner to pay for heroin-assisted treatment. So it's like a little revitalisation of the British system. They're actually prescribing it, paying for it, the police are paying for it. Which of course actually is very cost effective for policing because it reduces crime. So it's a good use of resources anyway. But the point is the police are leading that debate. And you know, that's the influence that Leap can have amongst policing. And we're starting to have those conversations as well in Europe. We had an event recently in Barcelona where we had a serving police inspector on the panel speaking alongside me. Huge coverage in the national press. And yeah, we're just trying to keep spreading that word because obviously, but I think the movement within police is the most important part of the drug law reform movement because the police are the people tasked with actually fighting this war. And if the police are suggesting we put down the weapons, then you know, if enough of us say that, then we can bring this to an end. Which is why we're hoping, you know, we always need more support. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Definitely.
We had a question coming from our live chat. So you mentioned the immense structural violence that's generated from drugs being illegal. Where do you see alternatives to this model working? And what are your thoughts on Portugal as an example?
Okay, so I mean, Portugal is great because they decriminalised drug possession in 2001. And of course we support that. You know, decriminalisation is great because no one should be criminalised for what they do with their own mind and body. Basically, just from a personal liberty perspective. So, of course we support that. And the Portuguese system is fantastic. Not least of which they had I think they had just about the highest drug deaths in Europe, and now they've got the lowest. And they've done that in less than 21 years. So the rest of Europe should sit up and copy the system, surely. They also have a massive reduction in blood-borne viruses, for example. But our position, we have to look at this through a policing lens. Portugal still have a powerful organised crime because it's still organised crime supplying the drugs. So from our point of view, a great example of legal regulation and where it can work well is in Switzerland, because they prescribe heroin. They actually used British evidence to inform their policy in Switzerland at a time when we doubled down on the drug war and went much more aggressive with it. So Switzerland don't have a heroin problem now because they did that in 1994, and since then they've had drastic reductions in heroin consumption, particularly problematic heroin consumption. They just don't have the heroin deaths that we do. They don't really have any heroin deaths because they look after them. So that's a great example for us. But of course, if you look at the regulated cannabis markets as well, I think there's a lot we can learn from the different heroin regulation that's happening in Uruguay and different states in America and Canada. But I think one of the things we need to learn, and in fact David Lammy said this, because I spoke at the 2019 Labour conference, and David Lammy commented on this at the same conference. And what he said is, when we regulate cannabis, that was an interesting choice of words, when we regulate cannabis, the Treasury needs to stay completely away from it. We need to make sure that it's not too expensive so that we reduce the illicit market as much as possible, which to me is the right approach, because that's why we need to legally regulate it. We don't need to regulate it to make money from it. We need to regulate it to make society safer. And so it needs to be as cheap as possible. And that's one mistake that Canada's made, because their regulated product is twice the price of the illicit product. So I mean, they've still done a great job. They've still got 50% of the market share, but I think we need to be ambitious to be a lot more than 50%, a lot more. So those are the things we can learn. And also, it has to be done with social equity, especially when we legally regulate the cannabis market. We have to make sure that the people who have been most marginalised by prohibition are not marginalised by legal regulation. We don't want rich international corporations making all that money from it. It needs to be invested in the communities. Because some communities, inner city communities, actually the illicit drugs economy is what keeps them alive. For some people, it's how they feed their children. And we can't lose sight of that. So we have to be investing in people. We have to be completely quashing criminal convictions to make sure that it's easy for anyone with a conviction to get into the industry. And those have to be the first considerations when we do it, I would say.
Another one, building off of that. Do you think that, like, the kingpins of the organised crime, the drug dealers, they're potentially holding the answers for this problem? Could they be the ones that could potentially be the experts on solving it and actually getting it regulated?
I don't think the people who are making the most money are the gangster types, no. But there are lots of people who have great expertise, particularly in the cannabis market, that we should be tapping into. That's another mistake that Canada's made, is that in some places they don't have the same quality that people have learned to expect in the streets. And cannabis consumers quite often are connoisseurs. They like their quality, don't they? So I think that wealth of knowledge needs to be tapped into as well. It needs to be understood and appreciated and tapped into. I don't know if that's the point you were getting at.
Yeah, no, sorry, it's a minor point, but yeah.
So you had a question?
Oh, yeah. You mentioned how police are often leading the shift in the ways drug offences are dealt with, like with digital criminalisation and stuff. How do we translate this to legislation when often drug policy and police policy in general is weaponized in cultural wars? Because I think there's a little bit of a, like, it seems difficult to push what would actually make the situation easier when it's being used for political gain.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. When I spoke at the Drug Policy Alliance conference in America, and I was telling them about how good the British police are because they've got these diversion schemes coming in. And the person moderating this conversation said, yeah, well, sorry, but I don't fall for that. Diversion scheme, it's a deserving scheme because it's still the cop who has to decide who deserves it. So there's not the accountability I was claiming. So I felt a little bit shot down there, thinking, well, actually, yeah, you've got a point there, because you've still got racial disparity in the decision making, even though it's a much more positive step. And you can't deny the prejudice in the system because the numbers are so dramatic and they don't lie. So yeah, I mean, it's a good point. But if a diversion scheme is the default, as in cops are instructed to use that first and foremost, and you have to really explain why you didn't, because it applies to everybody, and this is what we want. This is what, if the leadership are saying, we don't want any young people going into the criminal justice system for drugs at all, we don't want it, then that removes that systematic bias to a degree. If that leadership is good, and if that is the instruction. But of course that's the test, isn't it? That's where the growing systems of community accountability that police are bringing in, that's where we have to be involved. We have to hold them to account. And wherever anyone ever gets the opportunity to become part of those community forums or ways of feeding back or holding the police to account, you've got to be doing it to make sure. You've got to be questioning divisional commanders. What are your stop and search figures? Why are those numbers like that? There are ways of doing that. There are now panels of people who can do that. So, but we need to encourage that community accountability. We need to encourage people within those communities to try and be empowered and engage in it, take it on, I think. Anyone else? Yes?
I was just going to ask if you feel like at some point it would be possible for the police to start getting overwhelmed with the drug policies. Like right now, in Los Angeles, for example, cocaine is crack is becoming replaced with fentanyl, and if not fentanyl, it's all sort of synthetic brews that are just like spreading around like the west coast of the U.S. and like eventually that's just going to blow out of proportion. So do you feel like that might motivate more police to be, I guess, to start reconsidering the current drug policies?
Yeah, and it's happening in the States. A lot of my organisation engages with police and are winning over more and more police, particularly police leaders, to our point of view. And we've got a growing membership amongst serving police in the United States. And that is true, and part of that is because of the devastating deaths that are happening in the States. And we have the spectre of synthetic opioids happening here. Only today I've retweeted a warning from Release that there is synthetic opioids in some heroin samples at the moment in the southeast. And I think the last figures I saw is that only something like 3% of heroin samples in the UK have fentanyl in them or synthetics. That could suddenly climb very quickly, and we would have the same proportion of deaths as in the States. So yeah, I mean, it is a pressure, but it's not just the drug deaths that's a pressure on policing as well. One of the things that we say to police when we engage, and one of the things that we're trying to get the public to understand, is the sheer folly, the sheer waste of resources that the war on drugs is. And cops get it, really, but they need to be encouraged to talk about it and let the public know. So, for example, if a police officer arrests a burglar in a community, then the likelihood that burglaries will go down, because there's only a small number of people willing to and have the skills to commit that crime. If you arrest a drug dealer, crime goes up, because you've created a momentary gap in the market which is fought over, so violence often goes up, or you've had a shift in power, which means corruption is more likely to go up. And the harder you try and police it, the more crime goes up over time. The more you've created this Darwinian situation where the most aggressive and ruthless gangsters become the most successful. So we have to see drug crime as completely separate from all normal forms of crime, completely separate. The police get that, and they're increasingly understanding that, and police leadership are increasingly understanding that as well. Which means that if you're a police leader and you're thinking, well, what am I going to spend my resources on? Am I going to spend my resources on something which tackles the domestic violence problem by having a specialised domestic violence unit and use the resources for that because women are getting murdered? Do I put my resources into that, or do I double down and do more drug warrants? When I know that that can save lives, and I know that is a complete waste of time that's actually increasing crime. And this is the conversation that we have to get to when we talk to politicians, to the public and police leaders. That if you've got to make this decision, you've got to look at it in a cold, calculating way and be honest. What is the real cost of drugs policing, and how could those resources be used differently? And you know, any time you get the chance to talk to a police officer or politician, you should always talk to politicians about this. That's a really useful way of framing it, because politics is about decisions, and so is police leadership.